Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
Hello and welcome to the March 14th edition of Week to Week, the political roundtable from the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipper, your host for Week to Week, and I'm glad you defied the atmospheric river to come out here and join us tonight.
Thank you.
Today we have a lot to talk about, including abortion and pharmacies, Fox News, banking troubles, and more. So stick around. Let's meet our panelists for tonight. I'll start on the far end of the stage there with Melissa Cain. She's the host of the Get Out the Bet podcast. She's also a political analyst, journalist, and attorney. You can follow her on Twitter at ConstitutionMel. Welcome back, Melissa.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Next to her is Tim Miller, a writer-at-large at The Bulwark. He's also the author of the best-selling book, Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican Road to Hell. And he's on Twitter at TimoDC. Hey again, Tim. Next to me is actually our first experiment with artificial intelligence. We have had Dan Schnur digitized, uploaded to Skynet, and he's going to be joining us here. Actually, Dan is a professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications. He's also a professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government Studies. And he's on Twitter at Dan Schnur. So welcome, Dan, remotely.
Thanks so much for having me, John. I appreciate it.
It's so weird he's looking at you.
I was serious. That's not really, he doesn't exist anymore in human form. Okay, let's, discussing things about that don't exist anymore. Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. Let's start with this economic story that quickly took on political dimensions. The collapse of these two mid-sized banking institutions. Over the weekend, the federal government took actions to protect depositors and helped find purchasers for the company. Tim, Republican voices today have been offering a number of choices for who or what should be blamed. What do you make of their claims, and who do you think should be blamed?
I think that it was obviously the fact that Silicon Valley Bank acknowledged Lesbian Day and that they had a single black on their board. That's the Wall Street Journal pointed out. Must have been the reason why they collapsed. I don't know, because definitely non-woke all boys clubs banks have never had any problems. It is easy to make fun of, and like the Wall Street Journal column in particular, the one that cited the fact that he's like, I'm not saying that 12 white men would have done better, but I'm kind of saying 12 white men would have done better, not even, you can't even qualify it as a racist dog whistle because it was just so overt. And it would be the kind of thing that you would want to just dismiss, right? It's like these are like the crazy guys in Republican conservative social media, but DeSantis is pushing it. You know, like the person who's supposed to be, you know, the more sane or whatever, the more rational like version of MAGA was offering the same rationale. Said that they were distracted by DEI measures, as if like, you know, putting up a rainbow flag prevented them from looking at their at the interest rates on the bonds investments that they'd made. Like the whole thing is so absurd. So, you know, Nikki Haley, to her credit, at least gave like a based in reality like critique of the let's not call it a bailout, right? And you know, sort of making the sort of Tea Party-ish era argument that the taxpayer, we shouldn't be spreading this risk around. The taxpayer shouldn't be covering for these Silicon Valley bank CEOs that acted improperly. To me, on balance, like. Biden did what he had to do, right, to prevent the contagion, from going on to other banks. And I think that, the most substantive criticism you could give is that maybe, some of the juicing of the economy from COVID, from the COVID stimulus, caused some of the inflation, which has caused the Fed to have to respond and raise interest rates, which ultimately led to Silicon Valley Bank, getting screwed over the stupid bets that they made. So like there is some maybe triple bank shot tangential policy argument that you could make to criticize Biden, but none of these guys are actually serious enough to make that argument, and they're out here making stupid culture war arguments instead.
Melissa, how do you think the government has responded?
Well, first of all, I agree, of course, as usual, with everything that Tim had to say. It seems I've no love or sympathy for the folks who are making the really objectively terrible decisions that led to this at the bank. And I've been told they're all going to be fired. I certainly hope that they are. But it does remind me of 2008 when there was the actual bailouts, where Barack Obama just had to basically stand up and go, I get it. But it was either this or total economic meltdown. And so if the choices are backstop or even bail out this, pool of idiots, or cause a whole bunch of bank runs that close down a whole bunch of banks, well then, I don't think that, that people would, you can stand on principle all day when you're not in the room having to make the decision. But the people who are in the room having to make the decision, I think on the whole, did the right thing. They're going to get a bunch of stuff thrown at them. But politically, it didn't hurt Barack Obama in the long run. I think people still wish people had gone to jail and things like that. But, it didn't, he went on to get reelected. And, ultimately, the fact that sort of it did not, and there were a lot of impacts, but that it didn't actually cause an economic meltdown was something that was something that was useful to him and good for him, and he managed to survive. And I think Biden will, there'll be an initial, a lot of chatter, but I think as long as it doesn't explode into other things, we should be.
A fun fact I read this week about TARP, about that Bush-Obama bailout. As a moderate defender of the Uniparty, I read today that in the end, after all of the righteous anger that was righteous in a certain way, it kind of dissipated. The troubled assets, TARP is the Troubled Asset Relief Project, the troubled assets that the government got ended up accruing benefit to the taxpayer, like in the very long haul over the however many years that they eventually had to sell off all those assets. They ended up making more money than the taxpayers paid out in that bailout. Nobody really knows or cares about that, right? Because there was all this righteous anger in the moment, and then, by the time it happens, it's a news story in Bloomberg, in 2015. It's like, hey, guess what? We ended up making money on TARP. But a lot of times these are decisions that have to be made, and that actually what Paulson, did ended up being smart and right, and thank God he did it, really.
And the other, I was watching The Big Short again the other. I just had nothing to do with this before the Silicon Valley Bank thing just happened to be, and one of the things that makes me so crazy about that movie and that moment in history is the failure of the credit agencies, the failure of the auditing of the accounting firms, and here we see yet again where Moody's. Where KPMG gives them the stamp of approval, where Moody's the day after decides to downgrade them. You're like, oh, thanks guys, thanks for joining in here. You know what I mean? Once again, there are serious reforms that need to be made on various levels, and I really hope that this leads to once again a revisiting of the really truly terribly messed up credit agency problem that we have with the way that they rate things and the way that they end up sort of competing with each other and how that drives down accountability overall.
Sure. Dan, what do you make of this as well, both from the current political hit, but as possible down the line impacts of this? I think you're on mute, sir.
I think Tim and Melissa gave a really good overview of this, but looking at the politics of it, as they correctly pointed out, Biden suffers somewhat politically by being accused of a bailout and explaining that depositors are bailed out, but that investors aren't, is a somewhat difficult point to make to a mass audience. That said, the small political hit that Biden takes by doing a quote unquote bailout is tiny compared to the political damage he would suffer and the economic damage that the country would suffer if the government hadn't weighed in this matter. So the far right and the far left are both going to use the word bailout language. And I suspect the White House is philosophical enough to think, all right, we'll take the small hit, but if we avoid the much bigger and more substantive one, that's a reasonable trade-off. To Tim's point, and I think it's a smart one, to me, the biggest difference in the politics of it right now is the Democratic message is a consistent one. They're saying Trump did this. And when the legislation passed in 2018, it was supported by all Republicans, by a small number of Democrats, but ultimately signed by the president relaxing the standards. Republicans have a much less consistent message. You have some of what I'd call the more responsible members of the caucus, Representative McHenry, Representative Hill, and others, talking about the potential impact that Tim mentioned that inflation has had, first on interest rates and then on the challenges the banks are facing. Then you have other, obviously much less responsible voices talking about woke investors and the evils of diversity and so on. As my point is, as long as the Republicans are offering several different accusations and the Democrats are offering just one, then that's a Democratic political advantage. If at some point in the weeks ahead, either Kevin McCarthy or Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or someone articulates a message that the rest of the party rallies behind, then the politics of this might even out. But right now, the Democrats are unified and behind one message, Republicans aren't. And that's the political imbalance we're seeing in the first few days of this story.
And is this totally a federal responsibility? I think I read that it was first California regulators who stepped in and then basically directed it to the federal government. Is there a role here for the state government? And I am probably the second to last person with knowledge of the banking system of any level. Last would be George Santos.
There is a role for the state government, and it is a much smaller one. Both Governor Newsom's office and the White House made it clear, for both substantive and political reasons, that Newsom was heavily engaged in discussions with the relevant federal authorities over the weekend. The person to watch in this, though, is less Governor Newsom than State Senator Monique Limon from the Santa Barbara area. She's the chair of the relevant legislative committee that oversees this area. And even though while Newsom and the state treasurer's office will have a much more high profile role, if there's legislation passed to address this at the state level to complement whatever Congress does, then she's the one who'll move it. And given the right now, because there's a Republican majority in the House and such a small Democratic majority in the Senate, and the likelihood of getting 60 votes for anything in the Senate, therefore, on this, like anything else, is pretty small. Federal legislative remedies, as opposed to administration solutions, is pretty unlikely. So, in fact, if we are going to see legislation on this, it might not be as powerful out of Sacramento as it might be out of Congress, but it's much more likely to pass. And Senator Limon will be the key player on that.
Okay. Well, let's move on to something that is taking place in the states. Let's talk about abortion and Walgreens' decision recently to, its announcement that it would stop selling the abortion pill, not only in states where it is illegal, where abortion is illegal, but also in states where Republican attorney generals threaten them, even if abortion remains legal in those states. This set off, of course, a firestorm of criticism on the left. California Governor Gavin Newsom swiftly condemned the move and said the state wouldn't do business with Walgreens as a result. Details on that were slow to come, but eventually it was announced that Walgreens, that the state would cancel, I think it was a $54 million contract with Walgreens for medicines for prisoners or something. Melissa, what do you make of Walgreens' decision? Let's start there.
They were in a tough spot. I mean, as a lawyer, if I'm advising them and I'm, and they're concerned about criminal liability, they've got obligations to shareholders. I don't know that, angering Gavin Newsom was part of the conversation. It was more like, what are the risks if we continue to do this? We need to make sure we're being, especially when the landscape is so uncertain right now in terms of how these things are going to shake out. Are attorneys general going to really go after people? I mean, it's all, I feel like the dust has not yet settled. And so if you're in that room and you're trying to weigh what your move should be, I don't know that I would issue a press release announcing it, but at the very least, making that decision is in some ways understandable. I mean, you're facing criminal liability and in potential losses in an area where you have to maximize shareholder value. So it's it's not totally clear to me why Gavin Newsom went after them like this, or why he felt like it was so outrageous that they responded to these laws and to these threats the way they did. But I'm sure Tim will tell us.
Well, Well, was
Like,
that a
I was
political
about-
move, a political reaction by him, or?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, it's a good move with his California Democratic political base, keeping everyone happy on that issue. It's certainly a good move. We're all passing down the line. I'm going to say Dan is probably better suited than me to answer. Is California allowed to do business with anybody anymore? Like, Gavin has created a lot of rules around who we're able to do business for here, and that might be contributing to some of the prices in certain areas of various products in the state, where it might be better if we were purchasing cheaper products from red states, but we weren't buying products from states that passed certain bans, and all of that is right. I mean, I think is right on the merits. For Gavin Newsom to say, hey, in California, we're going to be a sanctuary for people who want access to the abortion pill. Good, right? Like, hey, in California, we are not going to discriminate against trans kids that want to reflect the gender identity that they choose in schools, and or let them go to the bathroom that represents their gender identity, and I think that speaking and being very clear about that and contrasting with other states is a very smart thing for Gavin to do. Like, he has tended to get into this kind of showy for Twitter, kind of political moves. It's like, hey, North Carolina did this thing I don't like, so now we're not going to do business with North Carolina. All that stuff makes me just feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? I like on the merits. Obviously, I'm supportive of people should have access to the abortion pill, but like making this decision it wasn't based on anything that is happening in California, right? If it was like Walgreens wasn't providing the abortion pill to people in Fresno, then like, okay, screw Walgreens. That's like in his jurisdiction. Walgreens isn't providing the abortion pill to people in Mississippi. Okay, that's bad, but like, should that, be affecting actions here in California? I don't know. I get a little bit more uncomfortable with that. And you see, I think, why you get uncomfortable with that when you watch Ron DeSantis, for example, do the inverse of that. Why I'm going to target, now this is not an apples to apples comparison, and we could get into to what I think is different about them. But, targeting specific companies, I would like there to be a really clear rationale for that. And I don't know if that's really here in this case.
Dan, did Governor Newsom leap before he looked?
No, he's thought about this quite a bit. And to answer Melissa's question, she said, I don't know why Gavin Newsom did this. Let me answer you. Gavin Newsom loves talking about abortion rights. The only thing he loves talking about more than abortion rights, I think, is Ron DeSantis. And look, he is a very, very skilled political communicator. And one of the things that skilled political communicators know is that they benefit a lot more from talking about issues that work to their benefit than those that don't. So talking about homelessness is complicated. Talking about flooding is frustrating. But toward Tim's point, talking about the evils of red state America is not only enjoyable, it's politically beneficial. And I'm not taking away from the substantive work that Governor Newsom and his administration do, but from a communication standpoint, this is something he delights on. So if there is someone somewhere in America, an individual, a politician, a corporation, who does something conservative on an issue like abortion or marriage equality or guns, Newsom understands this is the most effective way he has to rally his base. So when he does something a little bit more difficult and perhaps necessary on housing issues, on environmental issues, on other policy concerns, he's built up a store of goodwill by engaging in the kind of red bashing that Tim was talking about. Real quick, before we go on, Tim, I think you'll enjoy this because I agree with you that whether it's DeSantis or Newsom, this sort of performative corporation bashing gets a little bit old. And when DeSantis was out here in California recently, and the two of them were going at it head to head. I don't think either one of them came off looking all that good, except to their most loyal supporters. But this idea of banning products because of ideological differences is certainly nothing new. And John, you may remember this because you're as old as I am almost. Years ago, the city of Berkeley, city council, decided to begin banning brands of premium gasoline because of the human rights abuses taking place in the countries, either in the Pacific Rim or in Africa or elsewhere, where the extraction was being done. And so one by one, the Berkeley City Council would read about a horrible human rights outrage and would react by banning that gasoline in Berkeley. This went on for a while, and finally, the Berkeley police chief and fire chief had to come before the city council and point out to them that the council had banned every brand of premium gasoline in Berkeley. And therefore, there was nowhere in the city where municipal vehicles could go to fill their gas tanks. So they had to ask them, can you pick the least objectionable human rights violation just so we have somewhere to get gas? And that's
Can we
not
get a
making
ranking?
light.
Yeah, can we get a ranking of the violations and kind of decide which one we can suck up the best?
I have to admit, I don't remember which one was the least objectionable. And I don't say this to make light of the horrible human rights abuses. But Tim, I think your point is a good one, that when politicians decide to take substantive actions based on ideological distinctions, whether it's DeSantis and Disney, whether it's Newsom and Walgreens, whether it's Berkeley and oil producers, what they're doing at that point is they're putting the immediate needs of their constituents second. And from a moral standpoint, there are times that might need to happen. But where I agree with your point is that politicians like DeSantis and Newsom and plenty others over-rely on that technique. And as objectionable as you may find a potential ban on this medication, I don't know that banning a drugstore from operating in the state in reaction to it does your constituents much good.
I would contrast this actually with the state of Illinois, also a heavily Democratic government there. The governor, Jay Pritzker, and the attorney general, I believe it's Kwame Raoul, both have criticized Walgreens for it. On the other hand, they also met with the CEO of Walgreens, which is based in Illinois. And the attorney general afterward was kind of saying, well, wasn't kind of saying, he said, I don't like this decision. I understand the problems they're going through, though. I mean, to me, it just seemed kind of, he was not going for the quick, performative, darn them, I'm going to buy my Harry's shaving cream somewhere else. I mean, it was, okay, this is an actual legal jeopardy that they're in certain places, and it could cost them easily much more than the $54 million a year they'll lose in California.
John, if I can just weigh in on this real quick, in fairness to Governor Newsom and Attorney General Bonta here, Walgreens' home is in Illinois.
Right.
So if you're the Attorney General or the Governor of Illinois, it's a much more complicated situation bashing them. It's sort of the way that Newsom sucks up to Elon Musk when he has the opportunity to.
Yeah.
So I think your broader point is the good one.
I noticed that as
The
well,
right one.
Dan.
I'm sorry?
I said I did notice that as well, that he was doing the buddy picture with Elon Musk, just like a few days before banning Walgreens. You got to decide.
If you're Governor Pritzker or the Attorney General of Illinois, Walgreens is a major part of your employment and tax base also. But regardless of their motivation for doing so, John, it is the right point. If you are a company that distributes medication and you don't know who's going to be elected president next year, and you don't know how the U.S. Supreme Court is going to decide this Texas case if and when it gets there, you really don't know. There really isn't a clear path on how to respond. And Walgreens' government affairs representative, who incidentally is Governor Newsom's former chief of staff, did make it clear to the governor and his staff that Walgreens isn't doing anything differently than the other pharmaceutical distributors are. They're just saying out loud what the other pharmaceutical companies are struggling with, which is, how do you decide which government entity to respect, knowing that you could end up on the wrong side of the courts either way?
There's a PR lesson here. Sometimes saying nothing is better.
Yeah.
In corporate America, there's a bias towards saying something, and sometimes saying nothing.
Future business school class
Business school
on
class.
what not to do. Case in point, Walgreens.
Well, thanks, Dan. I appreciate you answering my question. I didn't put, rank political political grasping, on the list. So I appreciate that.
Well, and in fairness, and seriously, in defense of the governor, he does believe very strongly about the defense of reproductive rights. But it is a gold-plated political opportunity for him, and there was no way he was going to let it pass.
I should note that if you ever visit Chicago, or the next time you visit Chicago, go to the First United Methodist Church in the Chicago Temple, which is a skyscraper in downtown Chicago, and take the trip all the way up to the 23rd or whatever floor at the base of the spire, and you can go to the Walgreens Memorial Sky Chapel. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records.
What?
The founder of Walgreens was a member of the church when he passed away. His wife endowed it. It's my former church, so I have to put in a bullet. Okay, let's talk about some other questionable PR, and this would be the Dominion lawsuit fight with Fox News. For a while now, we've been treated to the release of text messages and I think email messages and depositions in this, centered around this whole lawsuit between Dominion Voting Systems, I think I have the full name correct there, and Fox News, and what Fox News has said about Dominion and its attempt to overthrow democracy or something, I don't know. Tim, what have we learned so far that you think is either the most significant or just makes you want to write your next book about bad Republicans?
I guess I think there was a little bit of "you are who we thought you were" about Fox to this, and so I think the areas to me that I found the most interesting were kind of actually just how far afield they were from in private from what was happening on air, right? You look, we all always knew that none of these guys liked Donald Trump, right? Like they all thought he was an idiot, they all thought he was a buffoon, and he won. And to keep the business afloat, they turned it into a Donald Trump propaganda network, and it was a totally cynical move. But everyone is that's not like really been a big secret. There have been plenty of books written about that. So the interesting thing to me about all these emails was, actually it went much further than that. There was one I grabbed that really grabbed me. It was Tucker talking to his producer. He said, "That's the last 4 years. We're all pretending we've got a lot to show for it because admitting what a disaster it's been is too tough to digest. But come on, there really isn't an upside to Trump." I mean, that could have been on the Bulwark podcast. I mean, Tucker would have just fit on right on in the Never Trumpers. There's been this kind of this lie that they've told, which is that we rationalize our actions because we liked his policies and he did a lot of good stuff, and the lamestream media is unfair to him and they attack him, and he sends a couple tweets that are a little too hot, and sometimes he shoots from the hip, but overall it's been really good, right? Like that's the story that they've told themselves and their audience, and these text messages reveal like they don't even believe that story. Like it's not like we all knew they hated Trump in private, but like they hate him and they think he's bad and they think that he's damaging the country, and yet still they continued to push forth with it. And so I thought that was most revealing, and the Murdoch text about letting Lindell back on the air by saying the decision was not about red or blue but about green. Which again is something we knew, but it's like, dude, you put that on email? That's something you think, but man. So I thought that those were the things that really stood out to me the most.
Melissa, tell us about the legal vulnerabilities of Fox.
Well, first of all, having gone, when you're doing a lawsuit, you're going to ask for all the text messages. You're going to ask for all the emails. You're going to ask for, and they're going to drown you in it, right? They can't not give it to you. So the other way they try to prevent you from finding this stuff is by giving you like terabytes worth of stuff. And so I've done this thing where you have to sit and search and like and I can't imagine what was going on in the office when they came across some of these things. Like the dance of joy these poor, beleaguered associates were doing at 3:00 in the morning. Like, holy, did you see this? Like, call the boss, call him. I've done these things, and like not like this, but you know what I mean? Like I know what that's like to just be like bleary-eyed and just like another box of stuff to dig through. And like this is amazing. This is like every lawyer's dream to find these things. It's truly remarkable. So number one, there's that. But to Tim's point, I mean, it's weird. Like as a viewer, you always wonder, do they believe what they're saying? Because there's always this question: are you this in it, or do you know that you're lying? Do you know you're lying? And that legally, that's actually the question. Like, do you know you're lying? And that's really what they're fighting about. And so I always wondered. And so for me, I was like, oh, they know they're lying. Okay, well, now we know which camp they're in. Whereas there are folks on the left who are like, we would never do that. And it's like, well, then you believe the things that you say. And I don't know which is worse sometimes. But there is this idea of you're saying these things, you're putting yourself out there. When I was anchoring, I would constantly fight with the writers because they would put something in the teleprompter and I would say, this is wrong, or I disagree, or I'm not going to say this. And they would say, just say it. And I would say, no, because people at home see this face. And when I say words, they think I believe this. Like they think I'm telling the truth as I understand it about the fire or about City Hall or about whatever it is I'm talking about. And so it's such a breach of trust to find out that the people who are speaking to you, and like you really, as somebody on TV, you really have to protect that trust at all costs. And just to totally prostitute it like they were doing is so upsetting. And I don't really know how this is going to go from a viewer perspective. I think legally they are absolutely screwed. Like there's so many admissions in here. Actually, the problem with this case is that it's so kind of big, right? Usually it's like this dude said this thing and this is the defamation.
Why don't you think they've settled then? If you think that they're screwed, that's the thing I can't get my head around. I don't like the PR damage for this is just catastrophic. They must think that they can win.
Well, Dominion might be making a really big demand and maybe wanting to do something like what Peter Thiel did with Gawker. Like we want to inflict like mortal damage to this network. Like we're here on a mission. It is inconceivable to me that Dominion has the amount of money that they are spending on lawyers to pay for this lawsuit. Right? Inconceivable. The lawyers are being paid by someone, and it is probably not Dominion, or these people are on a retainer that is so huge that the settlement would have to be just a metric ton to pay for the legal fees. So Dominion is not, they don't have this in their bank account. We're talking about just a huge amount of money, millions and millions of dollars for the attorneys so far. So maybe that the demand is super big, and so Fox doesn't feel like it can do that. But maybe they still feel like they'll just go up to the Supreme Court where they think maybe they'll have a nice audience.
There are two headlines here I want to share. One is the New York Times. It wrote, Fox's PR woes may not directly translate to legal ones. And the Los Angeles Times wrote, Dominion's defamation suit puts Fox News in serious jeopardy. So kind of to this point, Dan, it's like a Schrodinger's cat thing. I mean, they're screwed, they're not screwed. What do you make of it?
Well, I learned a long time ago never to question Melissa on anything, particularly legal matters. But the counter argument, and I'm not smart enough to know whether it's valid or not, but clearly what Fox believes and any number of media observers believe, well, let me put aside what Fox believes. This is clearly, it's morally reprehensible, this difference between public statements and private in private conversations. But if it's morally reprehensible, what we don't know is that if it's a violation of the law or not. The standards for libel in this country, as Melissa knows much better than I do, are extremely high. And unlike in Great Britain, for example, in order to be found guilty of libel, you have to be judged to have willfully maligned someone. And what Fox's argument is, which at least some people believe, while morally inconsistent, is legally valid, is that even though the journalists, doubted or personally rejected Trump's argument, that they were interviewing both sides. And when the president of the United States and his representatives, regardless of the president's representative's hair job, if they're making an argument, that is newsworthy. So, like I said, the moral and the legal standards here are different. And
that's hard on Lou Dobbs, though.
Yeah.
That's true for some of them, more like the Lou Dobbs, the Maria Bertiromo, and it's true kind of for the big three, right? Like Tucker and Laura, or like it was really more interviewing Powell. But I mean, Lou Dobbs was out there being like, they're inside the computer, you know? I mean, like they had some hosts, particularly on the Fox Business side, that were making pretty explicit statements.
You're exactly right, Tim. And so what those media organizations, those mainstream organizations that think that Fox might be able to get off this legally, they're making a variation of the point that you just did, saying that while a few of their more fringe broadcasters are doing this, most of their more prominent names weren't, and maybe that leads to a settlement. But if I can, John, just to bring up a related point real quick, not about the legality, but just about what this says about media and what this says about media audience. There's a famous quote that I know many of our audience has heard before. The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to like to say, "You're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts." But of course, in 2023, in a cable and a digital universe, the majority of the American news audience does believe that they're entitled to their own facts. And whether it's on Fox or to a lesser degree than on MSNBC, and certainly even more so online, they choose their media source very deliberately so that media source will reinforce their existing beliefs. Fox, more than any other media organization, helped develop this concept, and now it's coming back to bite them. Because if you read these emails, which I know most of you did, what to me was really interesting is Fox was worried, not from an ideological standpoint, from a business standpoint. They were worried that they were losing too many viewers. And they weren't worried for a moment that they were losing those viewers to CNN, or of course not to MSNBC. They were worried that they were losing those viewers to even more ultra-conservative platforms, to Newsmax and the others. And so they created a news audience that expects to be told a version of the world that they want to hear. And then when Fox occasionally veered away from that version of the world, they began to get frightened that their audience was going to abandon them for someone who did tell that audience what they want to hear. For Fox News in the long run, financially and legally, it's a huge challenge. But I'd love, if there's time, to hear Tim and Melissa's thoughts on what this does for advocacy media generally. If we together have created these audiences that expect to be told things that don't challenge our beliefs, but rather reinforce them. What happens when you don't keep telling your audience what they want to hear?
I'm going to take that and kind of direct it. I want to hear both of you, but Tim, I mean, you work with the Bulwark, and occasionally if you listen to podcasts and do the Thursday night live streams, I'll hear one of you guys talk about, okay, well, we're getting a lot of pushback from our Democratic supporters and readers about something we've said.
Yeah, look, I think that speaks to how big of a challenge it is. Audience capture is this term, right? Is a challenge even for people acting in good faith, right? Like even at the Bulwark, I find it sometimes like a tick, or sometimes I will do like a little wind up. It's like, well, I know you're not going to like this one, but XXX, right? And I notice that the Dispatch is another outlet that's like a little more to the right of us, and I listen to them to kind of check myself sometimes, and they do the opposite tick, right, to their conservative audience. Like he'll do a wind up and be like, now I know you guys are sick of hearing me complain about DeSantis and Disney, but I have to say, right? And so even in these kind of more niche outlets that have a more highly educated audience, that are trying to act in good faith, like audience capture is still hard. Like media is still a business. Even if it isn't about the green, which it kind of always is a little bit, it's also about ego and wanting to have a big audience and wanting people and just human frailty, like wanting to be liked, right? And so like there is all of those pressures like exist, like no matter what in media, and we have to all work against them and just challenge ourselves to like be open to other points of view. Now, okay, that's just on this minor scale. Now we have these massive, it's way worse on the right, and I can get to why, but like we have these massive, like, huge audience conglomerates, right, that totally exist based on telling their audience what to hear, right? And so and they have, and they're a much more mass media audience. So like there's some people in the audience that aren't as, familiar with the kind of tools of how to navigate through information and decide what's good and what's BS. And so they're just feeding a lot of BS to folks. And now each of those, as we've seen in the Fox case, are getting challenged by even more, propagandistic, outlets, right? I was at CPAC last week for the circus, and Fox isn't even there anymore, right? Like there's this whole media row of insane people that you guys have never heard of, right? That like people who have left Fox because Fox at all challenges them, in their thinking. And it's like Steve Bannon and Mike Lindell and like people that I've never even recognized who are getting mobbed, right? Who like have these little niche fames. And it's like that is this challenge in this new world, is where we can all, back to Dan's point, where we can all choose our own reality. That leads people down a radicalization spiral. And like the worst example of that is January 6th. And I don't think that a lot of people recognize, like a lot of times, as always, we're fighting the last war. Like when you're talking about what's happening on Fox, like the proliferation of outlets, that are out there for people that want, whether it's on social, on TikTok, on podcasts, on radio, for people to get exactly what they want to hear. Now there's this ability to live in a completely surround sound world, right? Like even with Rush, right? If you lived in Iowa and listened to Rush, that was only 3 hours, right? Like you still had the ag report that you got at noon. You still had Tom Brokaw at 6. You still had the local person at 5, right? Like that's not even true anymore. And I think it's a deeply dangerous thing that a lot of folks haven't really grappled with. Sorry, that was a long answer, but.
Melissa, can you answer in a shorter?
I'll just say this. It's, look, we're all, relatively, experienced folks at talking about politics. Any one of us could be on a much bigger platform if we were willing to say the things that people say to get those kind of clicks, that kind of traffic. You could be on one of those crazy right-wing things if you were willing to lie. That's the thing. Once you make that lie, once you make that deal with the devil and you say, forget my credibility, it's about the green, then that's it. Now you're creating a monster you cannot control. And that is what has happened. And now it is out of control. And now they do have like all these little like weird, I get emails all the time, all these little weird, right-wing outlets. They're just, bananas. But it starts with that initial break. It starts that initial like, well, let's just spin it like this. We're going to spin it a little more. We're going to spin it a little more. We're going to spin it a little more. And that's what's so upsetting about what the Fox News Texan thing show is they knew they were lying. And they had made that deal. And they were so cavalier about it that they were willing to just text like, I secretly hate this guy. Yeah. Like, what are you saying? And so that's the point that when you cross, and that's why that when you cross, you create the monster. And that's why it's so important to make sure you always feel like you're telling the truth, even when you're pulled to, and there are lots of great, forces pulling you to say outrageous stuff so you get more Twitter followers or blah, blah, blah. Resisting that urge is so important to maintaining, to keeping things on the rails.
For those of us who are old enough to remember when Walter Cronkite was a fixture on the CBS Evening News, people didn't know what his politics were. It wasn't until after he retired, he basically said, hey, I'm a liberal. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't have guessed it watching him do the news. Well, let's move on to...
Does anybody else believe that John Zipper is old enough to remember Walter Cronkite? I certainly don't.
I remember his retirement. I want to talk about a mayoral election that is halfway across the country, but that I kind of want to explore. Does it have potential impact elsewhere in the country? And that is Chicago again. When you're there visiting the temple, you might pick up on some of the local politics because there is a runoff. In the primary for the mayoral election, incumbent mayor Lori Lightfoot lost. She came in third out of a long list. So she did not make the runoff, which I believe takes place in April. She became only the second incumbent Chicago mayor in recent memory to lose a bid for a second term. For what it's worth, the other was the first female mayor of the city, Jane Byrne. Now, Lightfoot's defeat has largely been chalked up to concerns over crime and policing. The two surviving candidates in the April runoff markedly differ on crime and policing, with Paul Vallis supporting tougher policing and Brandon Johnson trying to downplay past comments he had made supporting defund the police movements. Tim, could this have an impact you see beyond Chicagoland? Because Lori Lightfoot was not some radical super lefty on crime and policing. I mean,
Yeah. This is, here we go. We're now policing everybody's own uncomfortable priors, which is important to do. I don't think there's a silver bullet to it. I think that what is underneath the frustrations about crime in the cities is a lot. There's a lot of pandemic-related stuff. There's a lot of cultural-related stuff, and there's policing-related issues. And so some of that is within control of local politicians. Some of it's not. I did a interview with Brooke Jenkins here. I don't know what everybody thinks about her for the Bulwark a couple of weeks ago, and I think that she's pretty clear-eyed about. I'm trying to offer a path that is progressive, but also that says we have to have rules and we have to have laws, and we can't just have people walking into to CVS and taking out a bunch of stuff and then selling it on the street and then going back in the next day and
If it's Walgreens, it's okay though.
Walgreens, yeah, it's Walgreens, yeah. I mean, nobody really wants. I asked her this directly. It's nobody wants somebody that is stealing toothpaste or essentials for their kids because they can't afford it to go to prison, right? Nobody wants that. But we do want people that are professional criminals to have accountability for their actions, right? That the same is true of drug users versus drug dealers, right? How do you deal with all that? And I just think that this is a problem that has risen. I think that in a lot of places, Democrats these are all mostly Democratic run cities, want to kind of point the finger and point the blame other places. But when you're in charge, as a politician, you have to be accountable for what's happening. You have to at least project to the city that you recognize there's problems and we're trying to deal with it. And Lightfoot just wasn't that good at that. She tried to do it, but she was defensive. She was, and so. In these places right now, in these cities where people are frustrated about, and I think it's true about schools too, schools and crime, you have to express, I'm trying to offer a different plan. It'll be interesting to see what happens in that runoff. The candidates could not be any more different in Chicago. And, we saw this here in Oakland and in San Francisco. People are frustrated with crime. People are frustrated with homelessness. And in Oakland, we elected kind of far left progressives that have one path for dealing with that. And in San Francisco, they threw out Chesa and replaced him with Brooke. So I don't know that anybody has developed a good answer yet, but I think the main takeaway is Democrats need to recognize that that there is a problem, try to offer a path that demonstrates that they're going to try to address it, or else they're going to get thrown out on this. And I think that's going to be true a bunch of different places.
Melissa, your thoughts?
Well, so the runoff is these two gentlemen who are sort of left in the race, and one is, as you said, is sort of trying to distance himself from his defund the police position, but has been clear about not advocating for hiring more police or expanding police presence. And then on the other side, you have someone who's really law and order. Now he is technically a Democrat. Some Democrats might disagree with his self-identification as a Democrat, but he is a Democrat too. And so there still is a left and a right in the race. It's not that she was, on the left side, but there is still this election that's going to come that's going to be really interesting to see who. This is a very clear decision point. And as you said, I host a betting podcast, and one of the betting lines is on this race. And it looks like, at least the folks who bet on politics seem to think that the law and order candidate has a much better shot of winning. But then again, these are not Chicago people, so who knows? But that the outcome will be much, I think, more informative. David Axelrod had a great article about Lori Lightfoot and basically talked about how she, in addition to what people perceive as not addressing crime, also alienated a lot of natural Democrat constituencies. She had an issue with the teachers union. Y'all might have read about a strike last year. So she angered some of the folks on the aldermans, some of the various aldermen. So there was some other issues. So we kind of have that gone, and now we really do have a sort of left versus right. As well, y'all are Bay Area people, you know what kind of left and right is here, So it's kind of left and right. But that election and those results, I think, will be really far more telling about what the folks in Chicago are thinking.
I am not a bettor. Again, Methodist, but if I were, I'll bet Paul Vallis will win by a large amount. Just the way, This is a city that had 2 mayors for life who were basically conservative law and order mayors. And
They're like,
I
we
think
can put up with
especially-
corruption, just like keep the streets safe.
honestly, yeah. If you this, oh come on, we're in San Francisco where half of the city government's being investigated by the FBI.
John, there's one other aspect of the issue that you raised earlier that I just wanted to take a shot at.
Please.
You asked if there would be a national impact because of this, and I would argue that in fact there already has been. First of all, the Melissa Axelrod Axis are right about this. Lightfoot lost badly for 2 reasons. One, voters in Chicago voters are very upset about crime, and as Tim correctly pointed out, when you're in charge, you get too much blame or too much credit, depending on the situation. But second, she has systematically alienated over the last 4 years every major political and community stakeholder in the city on policy differences like with the teacher unions, and just a very abrasive and very confrontational personal aspect that has driven away individuals that ought to have been natural allies. When you can make Hillary Clinton and Ron DeSantis look like they have good, warm, fuzzy people skills, you probably need a little bit of work in that regard, and it hurt Lightfoot. But within a day after the polls had closed in Chicago, President Biden announced that he was going to sign a Republican bill in Congress that was going to overturn the District of Columbia's efforts to lessen penalties on some violent crimes in that city. And it became very clear that the overwhelming majority of Democrats in Congress were going to vote with him. Now, look, in a two-party system, both parties are going to have internal divisions. And just like the Republicans are currently divided on entitlements and on Ukraine and any number of other issues, Democrats perennially are divided on crime and public safety issues. And when Biden announced that he was going to sign the Republican bill, the more progressive voices in the party on criminal justice issues accused him of putting politics ahead of principles. And I would argue that whether or not you think they are the correct principles or not, these are Joe Biden's principles. In the 1990s, he sponsored the crime bill that Bill Clinton ultimately signed into law. In 2020, in the aftermath of the quote-unquote defund the police debate, Joe Biden went on national television to say, fund the police, fund the police, fund the police. This is who he is. And it's worth noting that in the 2020 primary, many progressives turned to him, not just on this issue, but more broadly, because even if their hearts were with Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris, they wanted to beat Donald Trump. And regardless of the fact that many, many progressives object strenuously to a Paul Vallas or Joe Biden approach to crime, they knew intuitively that it was that type of approach that was much more likely to defeat Trump than a more progressive candidate. So to me, like I said, both parties have these internal debates. I'm not singling out Democrats. We could talk about the baffling place that Republicans are on Social Security and Medicare for hours. But this criminal justice debate has gone on within the Democratic Party for decades. And as long as we have a two-party system, it will never be resolved.
Well, let's move on. I want to talk briefly about a bill passed by the Tennessee legislature recently attacking drag performances, which apparently was a major threat to life in that state. So it bans what it calls adult cabaret performances in public or in the presence of children. According to NPR, at least 9 GOP-led state legislatures are pushing similar anti-drag bills. Melissa, are these more message signaling bills, or do you think they're actually going to do something?
It's not clear to me that these are lawful at all. I suspect they sound very unconstitutional to me. They're vague. I read the statute in Tennessee, and it says, any striptease or male to female or female to male impersonators whose purpose is to arouse their prurient interest.
The prurient interest.
Prurient
That's key.
interest. The
So
old
Bosom
period
Buddies
interest.
repeats are safe.
But it's just like, just sexually explicit stuff. But that's really hard to define. And so I suspect that what's going to happen is it's going to go into effect in July. All right, I'm just going to call it right now. It's going to go into effect in July. Some hilarious drag queens are going to walk right into the public library, put on a show, demand to be arrested, and then we will have a court challenge to this law that will potentially get it overturned. But it does seem like on its face, if Mrs. Doubtfire wanted to sit down and read a book, it would be okay because it really does tie everything to sexual.
You didn't find her to be hot.
Learning so much. But you know what I mean? Like if it's not sexually suggestive, it seems like it would be okay. And it's banned in public places or places where a child might see it. And so that's how they're kind of getting around and how the governor is distancing himself and his own pictures of himself in a dress from what the law is banning. He said, well, that wasn't a drag show. Like the cabaret show is sexual. That was just me, dressed like my grandma. I don't
making
even know.
fun of the fairies. That was just me making
Yeah, that was
teasing.
just
Not a big deal.
Yeah, but so that was the distinction. So it does seem like there are certain things that would be permitted, but I still suspect there's almost no way you can enforce this law that is specific and constitutional. So I suspect it'll be, and if anyone who knows, people who participate in drag shows, they will
Very meek and
they will
not going to
they
speak
will
up
make
at all.
this will be something that at least some brave souls will make into quite a show. I can imagine like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, like
Well, speaking
like
of
having a ball with this.
speaking of
Can I
prurient
admit
interest, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
If I can just admit something to the audience, John. I remember the TV show Bosom Buddies. That was the first time I saw Tom Hanks in an acting role. I liked Mrs. Doubtfire. I watched The Birdcage. I even liked Some Like It Hot. And if that makes me a deviant, then I guess that's something I'm just going to have to struggle to live with. But on balance, this is, to your point, this is a messaging bill. And both parties do this. This is obviously a conservative example of a way to fire up their base on an issue that's not really of any general concern. But if you talk about something loudly enough and angrily enough, you can get people angry about it. We've probably given it more attention than it deserves, but I like the Birdcage.
Yeah, I'm glad you like the Birdcage. We agree on that. Can I just offer just a different? I take it a little more seriously than that. I think it's worse than a messaging bill. I don't. For starters, this is not related directly to the bill, but I think all of the rhetoric and all of the language targeting drag performers is dangerous. We've already seen like Oath Keepers and like other far-right freaks showing up outside of drag story hours places. People are being menaced. I think there's very good reason to be concerned about public safety. But I also don't. I just am less sanguine than you guys about the fact that nothing will happen. I had an exchange with Governor Huckabee's office about this. I wrote an article about this for the Bulwark. Our friend Governor Huckabee, everyone loves Sarah, and she. It wasn't with her; it was with her spokesperson. And I was like, "Doesn't this?" Because they have the same bill as Tennessee. And I was like, "Doesn't this bill ban drag in your state?" Ban pride, ban gay pride in your state. Isn't Little Rock Pride banned now in your state? And they're like, no, that's a parade and that's fine and people could do that and wave the flags. I was like, have you been to a pride? And they're like, yes. And I was like, hey, did you see anything prurient there? Because I have. And so what is going to happen there? I don't know. Does this just mean one officer like walking by this thing is going to be a cowboy and decide that like they're going to be shutting ththese things down? I don't know. We'll see. Maybe nothing comes of it. Maybe it's just a messaging bill. But I think when you combine it with the targeting of trans kids and when you think about how this can be operationalized, I think it's certainly something to be pissed about. And I think it's certainly something with a real threat.
That's a good point. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be glib.
No, I didn't say
really
they were.
does.
No, there's plenty of stuff to make fun of also, and we can be glib and make fun of them. But I just think that potentially there's a more serious outcome.
Well, along those
But I think also, if I can, Tim, I think your point is right. But I wouldn't conflate this bill with some of the legislation targeting transgender youth. To me, they both emanate from the same place on the political spectrum. But I really do believe that while the discussion about how to work with and support a young person who's genuinely confused about their identity is a legitimate policy and cultural and social decision, I don't equate that, and therefore I have a difficult time conflating that with whether Tom Hanks or Robin Williams should wear dresses or not.
Yes.
I mean, to me, they're two very different challenges in terms of scope and intensity.
Well, we kind of laugh sometimes when we talk about Tennessee or Arkansas, but literally today, the Commonwealth Club canceled a program that was going to be held tomorrow where the speaker is a Sacramento-based transgender activist. And it was because she pulled out because she was getting death threats. And as far as I know, that's the first time the Commonwealth Club has canceled a program for that purpose. And it annoys me.
Yeah.
Therefore, I want to talk about Randy McNally. And Tim, could you tell us about
great.
Tennessee's lieutenant governor
Yeah.
and his prurient interests?
Yeah, I don't, Randy, like, this is a tough one for me because I just, on the one hand, he has a down the line, anti-LGBTQ record. In Tennessee, I guess he's had some softer rhetoric than maybe some of your most hateful anti-gay politicians, but like his voting record is pretty anti-gay, and he seems. I feel bad for. I feel bad for this person. He was born in the wrong time in the wrong place, probably. But he's 79 years old. He's a great grandfather, and he has been on Instagram, liking and putting fire emojis and heart emojis on the picture of young, androgynous-looking guys. I guess I won't say boys. They're over 8.
But we can say scantily clad.
Very scantily clad. Butt pictures, the whole deal. And he got confronted about this because of the ban, because of not just the drag ban, but the other anti-LGBTQ bills that are going through in Tennessee right now. And did an interview where like his face is like beet purple, and he's just like, I just like to be encouraging of my constituents and all this. And it's just, it's giving me really hardcore Larry Craig flashbacks, and
He's using the same PR firm as Walgreens and Fox.
yeah. And so I don't know. It's a sad situation really for all involved, except for I guess the main young man who now has a lot more Instagram followers. So I guess that's the only
Is he a
silver lining.
constituent?
He is a constituent. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, at least
He is a constituent.
And actually, the young man's comments about this lieutenant governor are interesting. They're not. He's not totally destroying him.
No, he's not mad.
Yeah, he's basically saying, well, he seemed to really be interested, and I disagree with his views, and I guess I'm not going to really expect deep thoughts from an Instagram model.
Influencer.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting and
It's like these things are going to come back. I talked to Chris Hayes about this a little bit last week, and it's just like we hadn't had these stories for a while, right? Because these state legislatures weren't trying to advance anti-gay bills, and so now it like feels like we have a flashback to the Larry Craig time, right? Because if like politicians are going to be doing this, then people are going to start looking through their personal lives again, and there's still going to be a lot of hypocrites out there.
Okay, well, I think it's time to move on to our news quiz. Do I have a volunteer from back there? I don't know if our volunteer is here today.
where's Fran?
Yeah, I know. We can't do this program without Fran. Well, okay. Well,
You got a volunteer.
you are my hero. Okay, thank you. So what we're going to do, I'm going to ask a question. If you think you know the answer, raise your hand. Do not just shout it out. And if you get it right, our hero is going to deliver you some chocolate. Okay. I call her the official week-to-week 2024 mascot. I'm referring to a candidate who ran in 2020, has now declared herself. You don't get that. You're a best-selling New York Times.
I don't
writer.
get to play? Okay, darn.
Okay, I'm calling you David Butt. Let me finish the question. She has announced that she's running against Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination. David. Marianne Williamson, yes. She, by the way, in 2020 urged the harnessing of prayer and the power of mind to turn away a hurricane.
Hurricane.
Hurricane. it didn't work. Okay.
Weird.
This is a film that you might have watched actually at a special screening here at the Commonwealth Club, and on Sunday it won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. Sir. Navalny, that's correct.
Oh, you guys did a special screening?
We did.
Wonderful.
Commonwealth Club has everything. She did, or he did. Okay. In the biggest Russian military victory in years, today a Russian fighter jet collided with an unmanned U.S. drone over what body of water? Sir, in the second row.
Black Sea.
Black Sea, that's right. I'm going to probably mispronounce this name. My apologies. Yoshikazu Higashitani. He's a Japanese YouTube celebrity and elected parliamentarian who was kicked out of the Japanese parliament for what? Why was he kicked out of the parliament? Right over there.
He never showed up in Parliament.
That's right. He didn't show up for a single day. If they want to fill the seat, we can send them George Santos. In another report of police violence, Ohio police shot and killed an attacker who had bitten a man and charged the police. Who or what did they shoot? Did you see this story? No one? It was a zebra.
What?
A zebra.
They thought
it-
the zebra was like a criminal?
No, it was a pet zebra who bit his owner. You can own a zebra in Ohio. And then it was kind of getting menacing toward the police. Now, I don't want to actually sound like I'm making fun of it, because when you read the whole story, it's kind of like that's a zebra that should have been alive, because they think it might have been protecting female zebras in the area. And,
Ohio.
yep. Okay, so anyway.
Florida, maybe, but
Yeah, now that I brought this to a ground story. President Joe Biden was in California today, and one of his actions is to sign a gun control executive order that will do what? In the back there, sir.
Me,
You, yes, in the yellow.
gun restrictions.
That's right. Specifically, expand background checks for a gun purchase. There were some other elements as well. Okay, we're almost done. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg said his company would lay off how many more workers? In the back there. 10,000 more, that's correct. The last one out, leave, turn off the lights, please. And how many more bags are in the, do we have two? Three, okay. Former President Jimmy Carter, who is in hospice, has reportedly asked who to give the eulogy. In the front there. Joe Biden, that's correct.
He's good at eulogies. Joe Biden.
Sad.
It's one of his biggest strengths. Eulogies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, those are all sad things. Let's find a. Okay, if you're a woman in the workforce, or just follow this closely, then you already know today is what day in the United States? Ma'am in the back. Correct. It's Equal Pay Day, excuse me, for those of you who celebrate. It's currently up to 82 cents per what those men make. And if you're a mathematician, then you already know that today is what in the United States? I think you were first there in the third row, ma'am? Pi Day. Pi Day, that is correct. Folks,
People love Pi Day.
nothing beats Pi Day. Well, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for everyone who's watching and listening on time. Thank you to our great panel, Melissa Kane, Tim Miller, and of course the digital Dan Schnurr.
hi, Dan. Thanks
Hi,
for
Dan.
being here.
Everybody, take care.